So I'd just like to start by saying that this is going to be structured more like a review and history of each game rather than bullet point lists. These games, as they evolved over time, didn't really take their previous ports and build off of them. Many of the games I'm going to be talking about have either started from scratch, went from 2D to 3D, or are simply emulation of the originals. While remasters and remakes technically aren't ports, I still want to discuss them as viable ways to play a game. Like I usually say in these videos, there's no wrong way to play any of these games. I'm going to sprinkle in some personal opinion, but I'm hoping that I'll have provided enough information on each title to help your own judgment of them. If you have any experiences with any of these games here, feel free to comment your thoughts on how they stack up with the original games, and let the comments be another resource for people looking for information on the titles. I have minimal experience gaming on my phone, but comments on previous videos made sure to let me know that's how some people just play their games. So anyone with experience on mobile ports are encouraged to comment as well. But thank you to Square for providing me a review copy of the Collection of Mana for this video. First, we're going to start with a look at the Collection of Mana as a complete collection and review that, and then we will take a look at each game individually and their re-releases. So the Collection of Mana includes Final Fantasy Adventure, Secret of Mana, and for the first time in the West, Trials of Mana. These games are respectively known as Seiken Densetsu 1 through 3. The collection was worked on by M2, who specialize in emulated ports, from many recent retro collections to Sega's Virtual Console titles on the Wii. The remakes and remasters of Final Fantasy Adventure and Secret of Mana are divisive among fans, so it was probably a safe bet to go with emulation of the original ROMs for this collection. And frankly, I hope Square continues to do that with their older retro games. I'd much rather have Final Fantasy III on Wii Virtual Console or even the GBA version as an option over this. The features of the collection include a music player for each game, different region versions outside of Japan, quick saving and loading, and different display options for each game. Now for Final Fantasy Adventure screen filters, we have a standard black and white display, an orange and white palette, and an attempt to replicate how the Game Boy screen looked, each with either a full screen or a smaller size option. Admittedly, the Game Boy filter looks really good undocked when it's set to the smaller size. This may be as close to playing it on a Game Boy as you'll get. Secret of Mana and Tales of Mana have two display options. In order, they go filtered full screen, filtered small screen, unfiltered full screen, and unfiltered small screen. They're not labeled though, so you gotta look carefully to tell the difference. Now when the Switch is docked, the small unfiltered option has shimmering, and while undocked, both unfiltered options have shimmering. So if shimmering is something that bothers you, you're gonna have to play these games filtered when undocked. I also think it's worth mentioning that the Joy-Cons are pretty good for co-op. Every game has a different border. The Final Fantasy Adventure one uses a pixel art style, while the Secret of Mana and Trials of Mana ones are faded artwork so that they aren't intrusive. But no, you can't turn off the borders, but you can at least turn off the button prompts on them. Now for these collections, it's pretty necessary to offer something significant in them, and the Collection of Mana offers the first localization of Seiken Densetsu 3, now known as Trials of Mana. Just as a heads up though, consider any information I talk about with Trials of Mana to basically be a primer. As there is an HD remake of the game coming down the line, I would like to save Trials of Mana more for that video. So while I still have some information to share about Trials of Mana and its localization, let's start with Final Fantasy Adventure. Final Fantasy Adventure released on the Game Boy in '91 for Japan and the US, and in '93 in Europe. In Japan, the game was known as Seiken Densetsu Final Fantasy Gaiden, establishing that this was a spin-off of Final Fantasy. It's a relatively simple action RPG game for the Game Boy, that draws many comparisons to A Link's Awakening, but just Zelda in general. In Europe, however, the game was actually called Mystic Quest, because the mainline Final Fantasy games weren't in Europe until Final Fantasy VII, so there was no point to marketing it like that. However, Mystic Quest is not to be confused with Final Fantasy Mystic Quest here in the US, which was also known as Mystic Quest Legend in Europe. Now the Collection of Mana version is just the original ROM as it was. The only real difference here is the hardware and advantages to each. Bugs and all are intact. There's no button rebinding, but select and start are bound to X and Y like how modern RPGs typically use X and Y for menus. Now let's talk about the other re-releases of Final Fantasy Adventure. Sword of Mana released on the Game Boy Advance in 2003 in Japan and the US, and in Europe in 2004, and it was a total reimagining of Final Fantasy Adventure, completely from scratch. It was developed by 1UP Studios, previously known as Brownie Brown. Sword of Mana is a lot more similar to the other Mana games and a lot less like the original Final Fantasy Adventure. Now, Final Fantasy Adventure being the first game in the series was really before they had their own identity, both aesthetically and mechanically. Sword of Mana features Mana-like gameplay, UI, story consistency changes, additions, and map design. Most Final Fantasy elements were removed except for the leveling up jobs, and even added Thief as an option. The game introduces a day and night system like Trials of Mana, ring menu and AI team controls like Secret of Mana, and the hothouse and weapon forging take after Legend of Mana. There's a more in-depth weapon and magic system, and the meter at the bottom actually builds up from doing attacks. Now, in Sword of Mana, you have the option to either start as a boy or a girl. To sum up the differences between the two, the girl can't use swords, the boy can't use staves, but they both can use the rest of the weapons in the game. Some areas are explored by each other separately. There's 2 other AI partners the boy and the girl make separately from each other. There's an extra boss for the boy, and some certain story beats are exclusive to each other. Sword of Mana also has what is known as the Amigo system. While there is no co-op, if you connect to your friend's game via a link cable, you can save them as an amigo, and when you have more amigos, you get to unlock summons. You can't save wherever you want anymore, and the AI can still be pretty useless. And people generally feel that the simple story of the Game Boy game is padded here and needlessly complicated. If you're looking for a more Mana-like experience, albeit single player only, this version is it. Next up is Adventures of Mana, which released on Android, iOS, and the Vita in 2016. And this one's a lot more faithful to the original game. All of the Final Fantasy aspects are left intact, though it now has Mana sound effects and ring menus. The game features autosaves, 360-degree movement, and touchscreen icon shortcuts, and completely updated writing. Adding a bit more to the action element of the game, the sword now has a standard 3-hit combo. Adventures of Mana also features a completely revamped soundtrack, along with the option to toggle the classic soundtrack. There's also an unused track in Final Fantasy Adventure that's used as the Dwarf Cave theme in Adventures of Mana. Now, AI have no control options and can be pretty useless thanks to being in a 3D environment where they have way more directions that they can miss in. AI friends are not invulnerable anymore either, they can be hit and downed. Some areas definitely feel like they could have updated from the Game Boy to full 3D better. Now, the Vita version does have stutters, and I really can't promise the performance is any better on mobile devices either, so just be warned, your mileage may vary. Adventures of Mana does lack some polish of a modern 3D game, albeit it was a remake of a Game Boy game, and it's not to say that that original Game Boy game didn't have some bugs in it too. For example, the heal bug, where when you cast heal, your defense actually goes to 0 until you pause the game. That being said, there are essentially 3 different flavors of this game you have to pick from, and maybe Sword of Mana or Adventures of Mana looked appealing to you, but if not, then the original game is still a safe bet. The next game in the collection was Secret of Mana, which released for the Super Nintendo in 1993 for Japan and the US, and 94 in PAL regions. The Super Nintendo version of the game is also available on the Wii and Wii U Virtual Console, the Super Nintendo Classic, and of course the Collection of Mana. Now, the font in the UK version is actually a little thicker, making it easier to read. Not only that, but the PAL version also had a number of bug fixes. Afterwards, Secret of Mana came to iOS and Android, iOS in 2010 and Android in 2014. And these versions of the game are based off of a Japanese exclusive mobile port back in 2009. This port of the game features an updated translation, bug fixes, autosaves, touchscreen shortcut slots, and updated AI controls more like Trials of Mana. Mode 7's gone, so canon travel looks like this now, and as you can see, water is rendered pretty differently now, and the art style in general is really tweaked. I think this version features an improved camera, and trees cast shadows which are pretty cool. There's some good quality of life improvements to UI. When you're flying in the overworld, there's now a minimap and location names are visible. And also, thankfully, AI doesn't have to stay on screen, so you can move without them. Now, unfortunately, not everything's for the better, as you may have noticed just from looking at the footage. It's got this worse, ugly, bland typeface, there's no multiplayer, and this is the sharpest that the game can look. I've tried many different resolutions and they all look the same. While there's no Super Nintendo hardware limitations on the music anymore, the sound effects sound really bit crushed. And this frame rate is pretty unplayable on my Galaxy S7. The most common issue reported in reviews on Android are the controls. The touchpad controls can easily get frustrating. I'd say a controller is required just for this game to feel okay. There's also specific spots where the game can potentially crash and be unbeatable, and the heal spell can bug out upon leveling up and become unusable. So you're really rolling the dice if you can even complete this version of the game. Now while I personally do not recommend this version of the game, I just thought it was interesting how many changes it made. Anyways, next comes the 3D remake, which released on PS4, Vita, and PC in 2018. This version can go up to 4K 60 FPS on PS4 Pro, and the PC version actually has no FPS cap and ultra-wide support. However, a quirk to this is that character animations and cutscenes are baked at 30 FPS, so you're gonna notice background details in the camera moving at a different frame rate than character animations. Features included autosaves, a minimap, and voice acting.
Here, you take it!
And a brand new OST that's pretty hit and miss, but the original OST is an option. So now the game has 360-degree movement and an updated script and localization, giving a better understanding of the plot. And some assets that were censored in the original release of the game have now been restored to how they originally were in Japan. There's been some quality of life improvements to the UI and menu navigation, and you now have more precise AI controls and can move without them being on screen. Unfortunately, enemies can hit you or them off screen now too. They also added some nice dialogue exchange between characters when you sleep at an inn. You can choose to have longer character names in this version of the game, and there is now an option to change how large stacks of items can be, 4 like in the original, 8 and 12. Now unfortunately, if you play this game on Vita, you're gonna have 30 FPS and plenty of frame rate dips. Now I personally feel that this version of the game loses a bit of the original's charm through things such as the bland loading screen, Get Whacked was removed when you land crits, Cannon travel was removed and is now just another loading screen, and you don't ever walk into new areas, you just teleport into them. I think these things can sound nitpicky to people, but I think it all adds up. Now that's not to say you couldn't call the original Secret of Mana a clunky feeling game, as hit stun worked really weird in that game and so did the hitboxes. But I just think that it looks jarring in 3D because they retained the weird way hit stun worked in the original game. Similar to Adventures of Mana, but even more so, I feel this version is pretty unpolished, and I feel they should have taken more liberties with the new 3D medium. Now there are still people that do prefer this version of the game. Admittedly, 360-degree movement is a pretty big factor in how the game feels, and I guess I won't knock it if this version of the game does sound appealing to you, but my safe recommendation is still the original version of the game. Alright, now let's talk about Trials of Mana, also known as Seiken Densetsu 3. It released only for the Super Famicom in Japan in 1995. The Collection of Mana is the first time the game is available officially in English, French, German, and Spanish. Working in cooperation with Nintendo, the localization took about a year. A far cry from the 30 days that Secret of Mana was translated. It's a bit of a technical achievement due to how much text was in the game and the complexity of the game's programming. Trials of Mana ROM size is actually up to 6 megabytes, and the impact of that was some minimally longer load times and pauses between new areas. Now we do have to talk about the impressive fan translation of the game that was released in 2000. It was one of the earliest fan translation projects ever, and it showed Western interest in the title. In other words, the official translation would probably not have happened now if it wasn't for this fan translation back then. Now, releasing in 2020 will be the HD remake of Trials of Mana, and what I would like to do is have a new video up around the game's release that compares it to its SNES counterpart. And you may be noticing that this HD remake looks a lot different than the HD remakes of the last two titles. Oyamada Masaru, the series producer, in a Famitsu interview stated that the radical changes present in the HD remake of Trials of Mana are primarily because they want the game to be accepted from the overseas audience. I have high hopes for the Trials of Mana remake, but we really are just gonna have to wait and see what happens. And with whatever does happen, remember that the original version of the game is still here. Now with that being said, I want to thank you all for watching, and I will see you all next time.